Hey everyone, and welcome to this edition of Storytelling Tips, where I'm going to be talking about measuring the return on investment or ROI of your nonprofit stories. My name is Vanessa Lockshin, and I'm really delighted to be here today with you to talk about this really important topic. We spend a lot of time talking about measuring the effectiveness of fundraising and communications. And I think the next layer of that, when we look at the tactics we're deploying in our fundraising and communications, is really examining the return on investment those things are giving to us, and stories are a great place to start with that. So let's dive right in. I'm going to be walking you through a couple of examples, and I hope that they'll get your wheels turning about how you can do this for your nonprofit. So, the very best advice I can give you on storytelling when we talk about measuring the return on investment is to always start with the end in mind. After all, if you don't know what it is you're trying to achieve, how will you know when you've actually achieved it? So, storytelling, of course, is a tool that supports various fundraising and communication strategies. So, I like to encourage people to start by narrowing down what exactly it is you're using storytelling for. Let me give you a couple of examples. And you might have other ones as well that your organization is using, but you might do things like tell a story in a fundraising email, use a story in social media posts. Maybe you're writing a press release with a personal story that you hope gets picked up as is. Maybe you're adding a story to your donation page, showcasing stories on your program website or on your programs page on your website. You make a list of things that are most relevant to you and use those examples as we kind of work through how you can do this at your organization. Of course, not an exhaustive list, as I mentioned, but just a few ideas to help you think about the ways in which you're currently using storytelling for your organization. So now that you've identified how you're using the story, you're going to want to get into the weeds and start to look at your metrics and markers for success. And this part of the process is where you'll want to identify what it is you're hoping to do, the story will do. So I pose this as a question of what do you want the story to do? And let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. I'll give you a couple of examples to explain this. So let's look at, telling a story in a fundraising email. You might want that story to help increase your CTR or click-through rate in the email, or maybe you want the story to overall help you increase your donation rate on that particular email. You might be using stories in a social media post. Maybe you want the story to help increase post clicks or shares to drive more signups to your program page or something like that. And maybe you're showcasing a story, on a particular programs page. You might want to use those stories to hopefully increase your program enrollment rate or increase inquiries about programs that your organization is offering. So as you can see, each of these examples, there are specific elements in the tactics. So by the tactic, I mean email, social media, your website, where we want the story to enhance that. So thinking about your own use cases for stories, what you're going to want to do here is pin down the element or elements that you want stories to enhance or improve. So what I would recommend doing is just kind of grab a sheet of paper, write down that list of the tactics where you're using stories, and then think about what are the specific aspects of that tactic that you're hoping stories are going to help move the needle on. And it might take a little bit of brainstorming, and that's okay. Some trial and error here. That's all kind of par for the course, what we do in nonprofit work. But I would encourage you to really dig in and think about what are your expectations of stories for these things. And you might even find going through this process that maybe your expectations are a little off the mark. Maybe there's some more concrete things that you could kind of lean into around storytelling and measuring the success of those stories. All right, so here we are to the fun part of all of this, where we're going to actually do some crunching of the numbers. I feel like we really can't talk about measuring return on investment without actually talking about some hard costs and looking at actual metrics. In a business sense, return on investment means that we are factoring in what we put in at the beginning of a process or beginning of a project against the rewards that we may reap on the back end of that project or process. Now, I would say arguably measuring return on investment on any kind of communication or marketing activity can be a real challenge for a variety of reasons. And if you're interested in understanding the complexity of measuring communication and marketing ROI, there is a fantastic blog post over on the Marketo blog that goes into a deep dive about why that is and what you can do about it. And I'll link to that here. I modeled a little bit of what they shared on the next slide, so you can see how they suggest approaching this. So again, I'll link to that below if you want to read that. But let's go ahead and deep dive into one example so you can see how this might work. So what I like to do is put together kind of a measurement spreadsheet, and I'll walk you through each of the different areas of this particular measurement spreadsheet to help you understand, what my thinking is on measuring each of these points and why they might matter. So I chose to look at the return on investment of telling stories in social media posts. So I would say it's going to be harder to measure the ROI on one single post. So what I would do for this is really pick a time frame for the measurement. This could be a quarter, it could be a month, it could even be a week. And you want to start with your initial, investment costs like staff time or additional costs. I was thinking things like photos, stock photos if you may purchase those, other things that, design costs if you have a graphic designer you outsource to. Those are all things you're going to want to factor in there. So from there, I would tally up the total number of posts that included a story. Now, this is where you're going to have to think about some criteria for what meets this criteria. It might be one that features a very specific individual story of a person who participated in a program, a staff member, whoever that might be. But tally up the total number of posts that included a story. And then we're going to do things like add up the post's collective reach and also their engagement. So if you remember thinking about, I think for this particular example, a few slides back, I talked about using telling stories in a social media post to drive more traffic to program signups. So additional metrics that I would look at as I'm measuring the return on investment for this are things like clicks to the website and then the program signups. So program signups is obviously where we're going to see the return on investment. That's kind of the end point of this process on using the social media posts for this. You could also think about this as kind of like the journey to signing up for a program, kind of like the way we think about, you know, the journey to making a donation. It's kind of a similar concept where we're looking at like the different touch points in that process. And so if you can kind of think about what are each of those points in the process of somebody like encountering your organization to becoming a program participant or somebody encountering your organization to becoming a donor, you can start to identify what those different points in the process are where we're looking at the measurements and the return on investment. And I think that that's a really helpful way of thinking about this and can really help you identify where you're getting traction, where things are falling off, and also where you can make some improvements down the road. So one final piece of advice that I'll share here about measuring the return on investment on stories is to have some benchmarks for comparison. And I say this because getting pure A/B tests on content can be a challenge, even at the best of times. So, it's not like we're running a subject line test in email where we can get a really clear, reliable result. Measuring the success of story content against non-story content is really challenging because there are a lot of variables and it's really hard to kind of develop a really strong control on that test so that we can actually compare some results. So what I prefer to think about here in this case is having some performance benchmarks. So this is like kind of historical data that you might look at. So going back to our example of stories and social media posts, just for one last time here, I would go back and pull some historical data. I would look at maybe a week or a series of posts where I did not use story-based content. And then I would plug those metrics into that same spreadsheet that we just looked at on the last slide so that I can kind of see some comparison of things like reach and engagement and program signups if I'm able to track some of those things. I think that this can give you a really useful starting point for comparison and assessment of your strategy, which is ultimately what we want. And if you're doing a lot of storytelling on the digital front, as I'm sure lots of you are, there are lots and lots of great ways to use Google Analytics to really sync up some of these different things. If you're looking at, wanting to measure donor journeys or program participant journeys, you can use Google Goals in a lot of different ways to get these integrations going and be able to really see at each step in the process where people are coming from and what those conversions are like based on their particular user experience. So definitely recommend that too. I feel like that's a whole separate post and video going into Google Goals, but I think that's a really great one to use. So if you're looking for some additional resources to take your storytelling to the next level, I do want to invite you to a free on-demand training that I offer called Your 3-Step Nonprofit Storytelling Roadmap. Knowing how to find a story and share those stories is really a skill anyone can learn. And it's an important step in really realizing your organization's mission and vision. So, whether you're looking to strengthen already existing skills or learn an entirely new skill set, this training will cover three really crucial steps to telling stories that raise more money and awareness. You can find out more about this training over at thestorytellingnonprofit.com/free training. And if you have any questions about this particular tutorial, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below.